Burnout is formally recognized by the World Health Organization's ICD-11 as an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Not a medical diagnosis in itself, but a real, well-documented syndrome with measurable features. Psychologist Christina Maslach, whose research largely defined the field, describes burnout as having three core dimensions that tend to appear together: overwhelming exhaustion, a growing cynicism or emotional distance from the work or role itself, and a persistent sense of reduced effectiveness, a feeling that nothing you do is actually landing. While the official definition centers on the workplace, the same three-part pattern shows up reliably in caregiving, parenting, and any role that demands sustained emotional output with too little genuine recovery, which is part of why the term has spread so widely beyond its original context. What ties every version together is not simply working hard. It's a sustained mismatch between what is being demanded of you and what you have left to give, continuing for long enough that your system starts running a permanent deficit rather than an occasional one. This distinguishes burnout sharply from ordinary tiredness. Tiredness responds to rest, a good night's sleep, a lazy weekend, a bit of time off, and the batteries genuinely refill. Burnout doesn't respond the same way because the problem was never simply insufficient rest. It's an accumulated deficit built up over months, sometimes years, and a single weekend, however restful, barely makes a dent in a debt that size. Burnout is culturally imagined as dramatic collapse, someone who simply can't get out of bed, who visibly falls apart. In reality, a great deal of burnout is what researchers now call high-functioning burnout. The person still shows up, still performs, still meets deadlines, while everything underneath the performance has quietly gone hollow. Because the outside still looks fine, both the person experiencing it and everyone around them often miss it entirely, sometimes for years. This is compounded by the fact that many of the people most at risk are precisely the ones least likely to notice. Conscientious, capable people who pride themselves on reliability, who have built real parts of their identity around being the person who copes. For someone like that, admitting to burnout can feel like admitting a kind of failure, which makes the early warning signs easy to override rather than listen to. The exhaustion gets reframed as just a busy patch, the cynicism as just being realistic, the reduced effectiveness as needing to try harder, right up until the deficit becomes too large to explain away. Because burnout builds gradually rather than arriving as a single event, there is rarely one clear moment to point to and say, that's when it started. It accumulates in hundreds of small, individually reasonable decisions. One more late night, one more favor, one more, I can handle this. None of which look damaging in isolation. It's the pattern, sustained across months, that produces the impact. Because burnout is so easy to rationalize away mentally, the body often raises the alarm first. Chronic stress keeps the nervous system in a persistent state of low-level alert, which shows up physically as tense shoulders and jaw, frequent headaches, disrupted digestion, poor sleep quality, even when hours are adequate, and a weakened immune system that seems to catch every cold going round. Blood tests frequently come back normal because the issue usually isn't disease. It's a system that has not been allowed to properly stand down in a very long time. These physical symptoms are not imagined, and they are not separate from the psychological experience of burnout. They are the same underlying process, expressed through the body rather than through thought. Research on the biology of chronic stress shows measurable effects on cortisol regulation, sleep architecture, and inflammatory markers, all of which reinforce the exhaustion at a physiological level, not just a psychological one. This matters because it means recovery has to include the body, not just a change in mindset or workload. A nervous system that has been braced for months needs deliberate, repeated signals of safety and rest to genuinely stand down. It doesn't happen automatically the moment external circumstances improve, which is part of why recovery often takes longer than people expect, even after the original source of pressure has eased. One of the most damaging misunderstandings about burnout is the assumption that it reflects insufficient resilience, that a stronger, more capable person simply wouldn't have burnt out under the same conditions. Research consistently pushes back against this framing. Burnout correlates far more strongly with structural factors: chronic understaffing, unclear expectations, unsustainable workloads, lack of autonomy or recognition, than with any measurable personal weakness in the people affected by it. In fact, some of the research on burnout finds the opposite of the popular assumption. The most conscientious, committed, capable people are often the most vulnerable, precisely because they're the ones least likely to disengage early, least likely to cut corners, and most likely to keep absorbing pressure that a less invested person might have simply stepped back from sooner. Burnout is frequently less a story about weak individuals and more a story about unsustainable systems, meeting genuinely dedicated people who kept trying to make it work anyway. Understanding this doesn't remove your own agency in recovery. There are still real, practical things within your control, which the rest of this series covers in depth. But it does remove the layer of shame that often makes burnout so much harder to admit to and address early, before the deficit becomes severe. You are not burnt out because you are weak. You are burnt out because the maths of demand versus capacity stopped working, for reasons that were very rarely fully within your control. Left unaddressed, burnout doesn't stay neatly contained to the role or context that caused it. The exhaustion bleeds into relationships, showing up as reduced patience with the people you love most, precisely because they're the safest place for the accumulated strain to finally surface. The cynicism can generalize outward, coloring how you see effort and meaning in areas of life that used to feel entirely separate from the source of the stress. The sense of reduced effectiveness often erodes confidence more broadly, well beyond the specific task or role where it originated. For many people, burnout also forces an uncomfortable but ultimately useful confrontation with identity, particularly for anyone whose sense of self-worth has become closely tied to being useful, productive, or endlessly capable. When the capability temporarily falters, as it does under genuine burnout, it can feel less like a temporary state and more like a threat to who you fundamentally are, which is part of what makes burnout so disorienting compared with ordinary stress. The encouraging research finding here is the same one that runs through most of psychology. Patterns built through repetition can be substantially rebuilt through repetition too, just of a different, more sustainable kind, practiced deliberately over time. This is the premise the rest of this week's series is built on. This video has focused on definition and recognition, what burnout actually is, why it hides so effectively behind ordinary functioning, and why it reflects unsustainable demand far more than personal weakness. The remaining 2 long-form videos this week build directly on this foundation. On Wednesday, we look closely at exactly how burnout quietly reshapes work and relationships, even after the immediate crisis has technically passed. The specific patterns in how you give, withdraw, and perform being fine. On Friday, we close the series by moving from understanding into practice. Concrete, evidence-informed steps for genuine recovery and for building a life that doesn't simply set you up to burn out again. If anything in this video has resonated, that reaction is itself meaningful information, worth trusting rather than dismissing or explaining away. Recognition is always the necessary first step in any process of change. You cannot repair a pattern you have not yet been able to name clearly. This week on Healing Through Thoughts, we're giving that pattern its name, in full, and then getting to work on it together.